Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. I'm here with Snapshot 52, aka Kyle Pittman, our resident expert in Native American studies and colonialism. This is Kyle's second time on the podcast. His first time was back in episode 75 when he talked about Indian policy and Indian sovereignty. Today we'll be talking about cultural genocide as it affected the indigenous peoples of North America. Kyle, welcome back.
Yes, thank you for having me, Andreas. I'm glad to be back.
Glad to have you with us. Actually, I'd like to start off by asking a bit more of a question for you, personally. I wanted to actually ask who your favorite historian was, period, in any time period, in any context, even if it's outside of your field, and then ask who your favorite contemporary historian was.
Okay, I would say, my favorite historian of all time is actually the one who got me really interested into the field that I'm studying now, which was Vine Deloria Jr. And he's probably the biggest name when it comes to indigenous academia in North America. One of the first scholars who was indigenous himself. He was Sioux. To start really observing the context of how the American Indian is viewed in America in that scholarly setting, and then coming at it from a tribal perspective on things. So he's probably my favorite historian of all time. He passed away back in 2004, I believe it was. But in terms of contemporary historians, ones who are probably still around, more of a controversial one, and I have my own gripes with him, but I do appreciate the work that he produces, would probably be Ward Churchill. He wrote one of my favorite books, which is A Little Matter of Genocide, and it talks very heavily, of course, about the U.S. interactions with Native American tribes. But besides him, David E. Stanner, who wrote American Holocaust, he's also another historian who I really admire in terms of being able to paint an accurate picture, or at least what I would call an accurate picture, of the history between tribes and the colonization of America.
Awesome. Your choices segue into our topic of today, which will be the phenomenon of cultural genocide against the indigenous peoples of North America, because the accurate depiction of these cultures requires also listening to them, and if the civilization has been wiped out, it's even if the people have their descendants have survived, but if the culture itself has been wiped out, it's very difficult to actually accurately represent what they thought, they felt, how they saw the world. So that actually is a nice little segue. I was actually going to start off by asking you regarding cultural genocide, how we would best define this idea, this concept.
That's a very good question. It's always important to define these, especially when there's a lot of overlap in terms of fields of study. For example, when we look at the term genocide, people today, colloquially speaking, they usually recognize genocide as just mass killings of people. And that leads to a lot of disruption when it comes to being able to understand a situation correctly or accurately. So typically for genocide in general, I like to use the United Nations definition that they have, a list of 5 criteria and 2 elements. But it's interesting because now we're getting into the realm of something that's not explicitly physically killing people, but rather their culture, their background, which can include when you actually kill the person themselves. But in that regard, I appreciate what Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in their report on the effects that colonization has had on tribes in Canada, how they defined it. And in their report, they state that cultural genocide is the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. States that engage in cultural genocide set out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. Land is seized and populations are forcibly transferred, and their movement is restricted. Languages are banned, spiritual leaders are persecuted, spiritual practices are forbidden, and objects of spiritual value are confiscated and destroyed. And most significantly, to the issue at hand, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. And while a little extensive and wordy, that truly does encapsulate the impact of what cultural genocide is. It's not just targeting a group or an individual to kill them because you find them inferior or in the way or whatever particular reason, but it's the eradication of their entire way of life, of being, of understanding, their reality, really, of how they go about living in this world. And when we consider that, it's easy to take one of these elements, like land is seized, and argue, well, everybody's lost land. Or to say spiritual leaders are persecuted. Well, all religions have been persecuted. But the goal here of being cultural genocide is that there is a demonstrated intent to do so. And just much like with regular genocide, that's the case for cultural genocide as well.
This is a really interesting point. For Canada's definition, does there have to be intent? Or...
As far as I understand, Canada does. They did sign the declaration that agreed to what the United Nations defines as genocide, but they did not define cultural genocide. The United Nations didn't. So, in Canada's definition here, this is what they constructed in this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in terms of how cultural genocide is described amongst certain communities that I participate in, indigenous communities, and going in academia and so forth, it's very similar to how it would be described as how Canada put forward. So while it might not be a universal definition, I believe it accurately describes what anyone would typically infer when they hear the term cultural genocide.
There's a book by Charles C. Mann that I'm sure you're familiar with, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, and he says something he writes something in passing that always struck me as interesting, and it precedes the era of active attempts to destroy indigenous cultures, which is, he mentions that in many indigenous societies that were based on oral traditions, the walking libraries of the civilizations were older people who would also be the first to die when different diseases brought over from Europe, such as smallpox, would inevitably came in after contact between Europe and the Americas. So before we get into more policies that attempted to enact cultural genocide, what was, in your estimation, the impact of this first wave of destruction of disease?
Certainly, it was a great impact. When it comes to Charles Mann and other historians who've had works that have been pushed into the popular side of society, they focus on a lot of reasons as to why those occurred that I have disputes with. But definitely in his articulation of the problem with which would constitute cultural genocide, Mann certainly does sum it up very accurately. You have these diseases that would be introduced to indigenous communities, and in certain areas you would see anywhere from 50 to 80 to even 95% of that population being wiped out, and the rest of that, whoever survived, sometimes they would go and they would join other tribes and they would be absorbed into them. Other times they would go to maybe a colonial society and so forth, be absorbed into them. But you really do see a loss of the foundation of what their worldview would be, which would be through those oral traditions. It would be through those lands that they inhabited, that they were forced from, or that they would have had to leave because of the disease and the death that was surrounding them. So the impact of disease should not be underscored so much, but at the same time, I don't believe it should be used as a crutch to basically say that native cultures were done away with, or that they didn't have any resilience when it came back to bouncing back from those disease. And as we get into it a little bit later, we'll see how that develops, but I think it's a paramount to point out that the theory that Charles Mann and that other popular writers such as Crosby and Diamond and Dobbins, what they perpetuate is the virgin soil theory, that tribes, because they had not been exposed to these European diseases, had some kind of genetic disadvantage regarding that. But there's actually been significant research that's been done to suggest that there really was no genetic difference, and that native populations would have rebounded and would have reacted to disease introductions just like any other society around the globe. It was a much more compounded and complex situation that occurred. You had not just these introductions of diseases, but you had willful attempts to exterminate these people. You had slavery, you had starvation, famine, flood, all these things that occurred that as part of the environment, but also things from the colonists themselves that would force these, that would make the situation created by the disease much more difficult to endure, and that's what affected their resilience and their rebounding, as opposed to it have just been an attack by disease. So while disease played its part in killing those who were already affected, such as the older ones who would have carried on that tradition, these effects of colonization, these actions of colonization, certainly did not help the situation. They exasperated this. So not only do you lose 8 out of 10 people who bear that knowledge in your tribe, for example, but the other 2 themselves are now persecuted as pagans and put to death. And that's a key thing to emphasize, because man himself does not do that necessarily in his works. He focused more on the disease, which creates a scapegoat, and it really detracts from the impact that the other factors have in terms of not only the physical deaths of people, but what would result in the cultural genocide.
Interesting. So basically, though not necessarily consciously, the narrative or the interpretation that puts disease at the center of the explanation of a lot of cultural destruction is really a partial answer, and really is de-emphasizes something that you see as far more fundamental, which is the human element, the actions of human beings to actively disrupt these cultures and civilizations.
Yes, certainly. And it's unfortunate because that emphasis put on disease has persisted down to our days. I mean, we look at Charles Mann's work on 1491. That came out in 2005. Even today, people still highly laud Guns, Germs, Steel, which I believe that came out 97. Yeah, 97. And then Crosby, who started the idea of virgin soil, he himself in a later work actually disavowed that theory that he had created, saying that even at his time in the 70s, that the scientific community inclines towards the view that Native Americans have no special susceptibility to those old world diseases. So it's interesting how people have latched on to these key ideas relating to disease, and it causes a disconnect between the effects that we see today and what had happened in the past. So people don't feel an obligation to help, and that in itself perpetuates the cultural genocide, because if they see no obligation to help, if they see no responsibility that can be placed somewhere, they also don't see the responsibility of working on such things as revitalization programs, or encouraging cultural diversity, or encouraging cultural centers, for example. And in all of that mentality, that conduct that we see in the majority of the dominant society, and American society in particular, it all contributes to that continued cultural genocide.
So it's kind of like how in the historiography of, for example, the African slave trade, you'll come up against arguments like, well, slavery existed there before, and we were just kind of engaging in it passively, and it would have existed anyway, and blah, blah, blah. So kind of, it's kind of a narrative that is not necessarily, well, I mean, you're not saying that this is like consciously done this way, but it seems like what you're saying is that it's part of its attractiveness is that it does not put any burden of responsibility on any descendants of the group that may have caused this.
Precisely, yeah. And I would say a good bit of it is done subconsciously, but from my experience, I also believe a good bit of it is done consciously. Because when you think about it, if you're being put into that position where someone's saying your ancestors, not even you, but your ancestors are responsible, or your government is responsible, that's invoking some kind of call to defend that honor, depending on which party you're in. And so not only general society, but even in academia, you see this stout attempt to defend the national honor, to defend the history, to uphold those that morality that's crafted, in whatever field it particularly is. And while there's an understanding why there's an inclination to do that. The unfortunate part is that it often eschews the actual view of things, and it hurts more than it helps.
Very fascinating insight. When would you say that this process of cultural genocide began specifically against the peoples of North America?
It's interesting because you can break this down going way back. I mean, you can argue that the roots of this destruction, because if you talk about what caused this destruction, could go all the way back to the Roman times, where you have the influence from them, and then the absorption of Christianity and the adoption of that as a state religion, and then the spreading of it and the influence that it had in terms of the pagan views that would eventually become Christian views as well. Because Christianity played a huge part in the cultural genocide that would come, in addition to the physical genocide. But that's usually a bit of a longer history lesson. So if we bring it a little bit further up into time, you really see the breakdown of tribal societies with the introduction of those diseases slightly prior to Columbus, but right around the time of Columbus. And when those diseases start and they spread out, well, as we already spoke about, you see the death of older ones among the first ones, and that in itself contributes to the loss of knowledge of those people. However, even at the time of the formation of the United States at the end of the Revolutionary War, tribes were powerful. The United States did not just go straight into war with them. They created treaties with them. The first treaty that the United States ever had was with the Delaware tribe. And that was because they recognized that tribes, despite their sufferings from diseases and from other wars, whether it be with the other tribes or with the European nations, tribes were recognized as sovereigns. They were recognized as being powerful. Therefore, best not to tick them off. And in that sense, you recognize that tribes must have still had a pretty stable foundation to hold that kind of recognition when it came to European nations and the United States at its formation. So it wasn't until probably around the time of Andrew Jackson and Indian removal that we really start to see inroads being made against tribes outside of a sovereign status view, and the implementation of legislation that would affect tribes rather than being done strictly through treaties. And from the moment that you start seeing that legislation, you see that the United States is forcing their views, their Western centric views on these tribes, and that in itself is the beginning of assimilation and the cultural genocide, really, because they're saying that, okay, you might have sovereignty, but now we're going to limit that sovereignty and impose our views on you because we think we can do that. And that in itself affects the culture. It affects how they understand things. It affects how they deal with things. And that leads up to the further escalation of legislation and outright acts of genocide that contribute to the cultural genocide that entails.
Interesting. Out of curiosity, would you call this process of, I mean, it's often almost euphemistically referred to as American expansion westward. Would you consider this a part of colonization? Would you call it colonialist?
I certainly would. When we consider settler colonialism, I mean, it's right in the name, settler, and colonialism. They're going to another land, and they're breaking down the structures that are already there to institute their own structures. By expanding westward, the colonists who would eventually arrive in certain areas, they would forever change the landscape that was there. They managed their land differently than how tribes did. They managed livestock and herds differently than they did. Just the general concept of how they lived and what they did on that land would transform the land. And of course, it impacted the interactions that tribes would have with those settlers as well. And then you see tribes, as the United States grows stronger and the tribes in themselves, their power starts to decline. You see that tribes are forced to play by the rules, essentially, that the United States is establishing. And even though they did try to fight back, you see an eventual time where they are subjugated to the United States, and then they are pretty much forced all the time to play by their rules in a paternalistic nature.
Out of curiosity as well, and linked to that, It seems like before we press on, because we're already entering the 19th century, it seems like it would be pertinent to talk about the possible role of the role of racism in this whole situation, which is in Aimé César's, I'm sure I'm butchering the name, but Aimé César's book Discourse on Colonialism, one of the things he talks about is that in order to understand colonialism as a phenomenon, you have to understand, and racism as a phenomenon, you have to understand them as intimately linked. One, the racism as an ideology or way of thinking, justifying the existing social order as such. And I was just going to ask you, do you think that that applies in this case, number one? And number two, what is the evolution of racism against indigenous peoples in this context?
Well, I would certainly agree that in order to understand the situation, there is a fundamental link that has to be seen between colonialism and racism. In every single act, legislation, and I'm sure you can find it in certain treaties, but one could argue nearly all treaties, there are elements of racism that are seen. And from the very beginning, when we look at things, even prior to the formation of the United States, European nations coming over here, race was always an integral part of why they were doing something. You had the Catholic Church, who passed numerous papal bulls, which were essentially laws that allowed these European nations to go to other lands in their eyes. And if people there were pagan, they were considered inferior. In fact, they were considered so inferior that the land might as well have been empty. And that's why the European nation was allowed to claim that land, because they didn't view the people there as being people. So even then, once you see those inroads of colonization, you see how those sentiments are then implemented into the institutions that the various nations that would come out of the Americas that they created. You see those very same things. Leading up to the Indian Removal Act, after the formation of the United States, you have the Marshall Trilogy of Supreme Court cases. 3 court cases in particular, which was Johnson versus McIntosh, Worcester versus Georgia, and Georgia versus the Cherokee Nation. Those 3 cases are the foundation of the federal Indian policy of law and how the United States operates with the tribes nowadays. Even then, you see the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall implementing those very same ideas that were intrinsically racist, saying that even though they were recognized as independent and distinct political communities, they've become domestic dependent nations, like a ward to his guardian, essentially saying that tribes do not have the capacity to govern themselves, and that is why the federal government needs to take charge of them. Now, while those cases did provide some good for tribes in some sense, that was ultimately a limiting of their sovereignty and the beginning of that paternalistic nature that we see manifesting itself in basically every piece of legislation from there on out. And it's this idea that the tribes cannot manage themselves because they're inferior, because they're savage, because they're incompetent, that these ideas have persisted. Vine Deloria Jr., in his book Custer Died for Your Sins, I believe I might have mentioned this on the last podcast episode, he talks about how in American society there's a distinction drawn between minorities in how whites see them. He wrote the book in 1969, so there's a little bit of context there at the time. But essentially he was saying that the dominant society, white society, sees the Indian as a wild animal, something that could be tamed, something that could be brought into the fold, assimilated. Even though it can never fully be a part of white society, it stood a better chance of being a part of that society and learning how to operate within it, as opposed to the black, who was viewed as a labor animal, something that was supposed to be outside, that wasn't supposed to be brought into the fold. And when you think about it in that context, you really do see how that was manifested in that legislation and in history. The acts that we'll talk about, they had a goal of assimilation. Even recently, the United States has come out and said that the goal was assimilation. That was the policy. We wanted to bring these tribes in. We wanted to eliminate their way of life so that way they could be civilized. So the idea that racism is a core principle of colonialism is very true. You cannot have colonialism, essentially, that we've seen so far, unless there was an act of racism involved, because racism was the justification for that colonialism.
Fascinating. Oh God, I'm loving this conversation. Perfect. So let's bring this back to the concrete policies which implement. We talked about Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies. Why do you think that we kick off with Andrew Jackson and not earlier?
Well, earlier, prior to Andrew Jackson, you do see U.S. presidents and Congress people, they have interactions with tribes. Thomas Jefferson himself was definitely not a friend of Indians. But the reason to focus more on Andrew Jackson was because he was one of the first presidents to enact legislation that not only dealt with tribes, because that had already been done, but in reality, when you observe the Indian Removal Act, he surely went against the founding principles of that federal Indian policy. So much so that I would claim it to be unconstitutional, the Indian Removal Act, trying to remove those tribes from their recognized land on the eastern seaboard over to Oklahoma. But it was an attempt at genocide, truly, too, by the United States in how that was carried out. Prior to Andrew Jackson, tribes, again, had that very powerful status. The United States recognized these tribes as sovereign. They made treaties with them. And the Constitution itself mentions tribes 3 times. And it's always, even down to today, been interpreted in the context that tribes were recognized as sovereigns. If you had asked the Founding Fathers today how they saw tribes ending up, they definitely would not have said in the state that they are now, where the federal government manages them, because they were viewed as sovereign and as powerful as Spain or England or France or China. So, focusing on Andrew Jackson, who was known as an Indian killer, he really hardballed against even the internal balances and checks and things that were put in place to protect the tribes, such as by the Supreme Court. And from then on out, now you see the formation of the Bureau, what would become the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You will see soon, in 20 years, the establishment of reservations, or at least the idea for reservations among the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And then leading up to 1871, you see the elimination of the treaty-making process with tribes themselves. But typically, you look at Andrew Jackson, and he's been a topic of discussion lately, with the idea of rebranding the $20 bill. People still look up to him. In the same light how some people still look up to Christopher Columbus. And I think it's important to understand that this veneration, really, it's not necessary, but at the same time, it hurts the people that these people ultimately affected. It's still down to today. It's part of that cultural genocide. To see that veneration of someone who was known as an Indian killer, and yet people still tell tribes, well, fix your own problems. We had nothing to do with it. As opposed to other presidents where you don't see the exact same veneration when their actions weren't so blatant against tribes.
Right. And do you think that the fact that, on the one hand, Jackson himself was a plantation owner, and on the other hand, that a great deal of the vote that carried him into the presidency was in regions that were either directly dependent or indirectly dependent on the plantation economy, and the plantations needed to expand westward, do you think that is interconnected with the forcefulness of the Indian removal policy of the time?
Oh, most certainly. The fact that, again, like you mentioned, he owned plantations themselves, and the people, he was a popular person at the time. It was a populist movement that got him into that position. It certainly would have had an influence on how he viewed things, how he did things. He's even known, actually, for adopting an Indian orphan boy at one point during his campaigns. Yet the ironic thing being, he was a general. The chances are that boy was orphaned. because of his orders, not necessarily him directly. But the whole context does definitely play a role into how Jackson would have executed his policies, and when it came to Indian removal, but also the general expansion westward.
Yeah, it's a kind of trifecta between racism, which places the indigenous peoples of North America as inferior and at best a dependent on whites, a burning self-interest, which is get new plantations, expand westward, get more fertile lands, and then finally a willingness to abrogate the sovereignty that they themselves had recognized in these tribes and in these treaties.
Oh, certainly. One of the biggest reasons that Jackson actually hardlined against the tribes in the southeast is because gold was discovered on their lands. But in addition, in Georgia, for example, with the Cherokee Nation, the settlers there, they wanted those lands. They wanted to farm those lands. They wanted to have it under jurisdiction. The state government wanted to be able to tax that to a degree. So Jackson, being the nationalist that he was, he certainly wanted to make sure that the people who voted for him had their way. And having another sovereign nation within their borders definitely prohibited that. So he had a great incentive both to his constituents but also to his personal views to want to devalue and delegitimize and diminish the sovereignty that tribes had and that was recognized at that time.
Interesting. And so we start with Andrew Jackson. He kickstarts the really powerful push. How did the process of cultural genocide then evolve from there?
Well, from that point, when you see the expansion westward, as mentioned, you see the formation of certain policies. In the 1850s, you see through certain pieces of documents that the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and other federal agencies began developing the idea of reservations. Well, we want to go and take these lands from these tribes, but we don't necessarily want to start a war over it. So they would go in and a lot of times under duress get tribes to sign these treaties, and the tribe would cede lands that they viewed as theirs, but in exchange, the government would section off a piece of their land and say, okay, you may retain this bit of your land, and we will protect you, and we will provide some of these services. So the idea being that tribes still retained their sovereignty because they did not, the United States did not give them land. They retained land they already had, and they gave land to the United States. But it's from these reservations that we begin to see containment, that we see the isolation of their people, but also their culture. Because indigenous communities, indigenous thought is largely land-based in terms of its ontology, its pedagogy, its epistemology. It depends on the context of where that tribe is. So by limiting their lands and cutting them off from that, you are effectively starting cultural genocide because, for example, that tribe may no longer be able to go to what they considered sacred spots because some kind of arbitrary line was drawn on a map, and the tribes don't recognize that a lot of the times, but the United States does. And so once that line was crossed, it could be viewed as an act of war. And then you have the physical genocide that would start from there. Moving on from that.
Wait, hold on. Sorry to interrupt you there, but that's actually a very interesting idea, because would a parallel, for example, be the way in which, for example, the Jewish people after they left Israel viewed the Holy Land until the creation of the Jewish state in the 20th century? It was just kind of like, these aren't just any lands. It's not just a territory. They were looking for the territory that was historically significant to them. It is their holy site, right?
Oh yeah, yes, exactly. The land in general, they never necessarily would define, with a line or a demarcation kind of boundary. They knew which lands they were. They would say, well, it extends from this mountain range to that part of the mountain range. And the United States, of course, not operating on that kind of a basis, would say, well, no, we need to clearly define and mark these out. So the tribe might agree to it, but the chances are, like I said, most tribes signed under duress. They didn't understand the context. They didn't understand what was necessarily being done. They just knew that this group of people with guns showed up. They need to sign this piece of paper. Then they went away. So they would do so. And yet they would still recognize certain lands as being theirs because that's where they've always gone.
Right. Interesting. Sorry, and you were gonna jump off from there to continue on to your next.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So from there, and it's interesting because it's included in the treaties, the United States promised to provide education to these tribes. Well, the education that they provided came in the form of boarding schools, which was definitely not the education that the tribes were expecting to come. And this boarding school era was such a detrimental impact, such a tragedy. It really, truly is genocidal what happened in these schools all across North America. The United States, the Canadian government as well, they would go to these tribes and they would take the children as young as 6 years old from the parents, even at certain points saying that Indian parents did not have the right to educate their children, and send them to boarding schools, oftentimes hundreds of miles away. And at these boarding schools, they were forbidden to speak their language, and if they did, they were beat for it. They had their hair cut, which caused a cultural confusion for the children. They were neglected, often to the point where some even died. And they were occasionally allowed to return home. They might go home during the summer, but then they would come right back. And this was carried on for generations. Even today, I know people who went to boarding schools. They're certainly elders in the community, but it happened for a very long time. I believe the last one in Canada was shut down in 1990. And so this impact of these schools, it can't be understated. When you go to these schools and you're placed in a completely different cultural context from the one that you're used to from a very young age, it creates this trauma because the child no longer associates themselves as being an Indian because they're told being an Indian is wrong, that it's pagan, that God does not like that, and you will be condemned if you continue to be an Indian. And that was part of the guiding philosophy that these schools operated on: kill the Indian and save the man. And so because of that, you see a bountiful death of tribal culture. Going back to the example where they had their hair cut off. For many tribes, you don't cut your hair unless someone's passed away. Well, when these children were brought into these schools and had their hair cut, it throws them into the immediate situation where someone's died. But they always had to have their hair cut. So they thought, was someone always dead? And while it might not seem like much at first, if that's all you know in terms of that kind of an action, it really confuses you as to what you do when you go back to your native community and you have short hair. But then it becomes a habit. You always have short hair. So you start to see the death of that part of their culture, an abandonment of it. And it creates not only a trauma within that child, but an intergenerational trauma, because there are many emotional scars that were associated with the schools. And what happens when you have emotional scars? You turn to outlets. Well, alcohol was introduced by various government institutions for the tribes, so you turn to alcohol. You have the spread of drugs in communities. You turn to drug use. Well, what happens when you have a child? You have a child, and then the effects that you endured, that trauma that you have, and those problems that you now have from drug and alcohol abuse, you transfer to your child. There's no time to focus on the culture there. So ultimately, you have an eradication of that person's spirit and identity as an Indian, and it transfers to their child. Then you see the death of not only that person, possibly due to the drug and alcohol use, but you see the death of that person as an Indian. The Indian has been killed, and in the view of the United States, the man has been saved.
That's horrifying. I don't know if there's another word for it. Is there really any other context in the history of the United States where the American government was permitted to enter the homes of people within the territory of the United States? Or this is even extraterritorial because they were still considered foreign nations. Go into foreign territory, essentially kidnap children, and then educate them as the United States saw fit. Is there any other context, like any other occasion or situation where this has happened?
As far as I know, not to the degree. You might have certain isolated incidents where that occurred in other minority communities in the United States. However, not to the degree that it happened with the American Indian tribes, because this wasn't just the idea of one federal agency. This wasn't the idea of just Congress. This was the policy of the United States to do this. And the BIA itself on its FAQ website, it states that up until 1934, which was the year the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, that was the goal. And even after then, you can look for other examples of assimilation in boarding schools that continued past 1934. But they admit it. That was their goal, was to assimilate the Indian tribes into white society. And I think that's why it's important when we observe the definition of genocide as proposed by the UN, and something that the United States itself also has agreed to, by the way, where the fifth criteria states that it's counted as genocide to forcefully remove children from their families, that and effectively eliminates them as part of that culture. And we can see how it's not only cultural genocide, but it's physical genocide.
We had some technical difficulties, and I had to interrupt this a moment, but we are back. So you were explaining how it is different from the cultural genocide through things such as boarding schools was different, fundamentally different from the extent to which similar things may have happened against other minority groups in the United States because of just how systematic and both systematic and how it was in general and how long the policy lasted.
Yes, because we go back to the example that I gave of what Vine Deloria said, the general view of what it was towards these minority groups. The idea was to continue to put these pressure on tribes. They would eventually die out and be adopted into that greater American society. And there was a very key reason for doing this. It wasn't just because of racism or a difference in culture, those clashes that involved. It was because the tribes, even today, are recognized as sovereigns. It's because they have, as per the Constitution, a position of power in the United States. Granted, it has been diminished because the United States is working towards that. The eventual goal is the termination of tribes, as mentioned in the previous episode I did. But the reason being, again, tribes actually have some power in the United States, and the United States doesn't like that. Tribes can manage what they do on their lands, they can create their own laws, and they exist within this political sphere, and in certain ways it becomes a drain on the United States. So the government has a vested interest in eliminating these tribes and just saying, well, you're not Native American, you're just an American. That gives them jurisdiction, that gives them control over them, but also their assets. So not only again, do we see the fact that they call them inferior, that they're incompetent, but now but you also have something that we want. And that was definitely a big motivation in terms of these boarding schools. Well, if you can kill the Indian and save the man, then this person's just another American. Therefore, we get what they have. And that's something that no other minority group in the United States has. So there's that key difference.
At what point did, like, a boarding school, for example, would it be installed in a given area? When would a tribe be fully subjected to this? Only once it's been basically surrounded by the United States in terms of the expansion of settlers and things like that, or?
In certain cases, because the United States had a treaty obligation to provide education as one of these services for tribes, occasionally they would set up reservations, boarding schools on reservations, and have the children locally attend those boarding schools. However, they would often set these boarding schools up outside of reservation boundaries, so that way the children would be shipped hundreds of miles away out of the jurisdiction of that tribe and the reservation. So it was kind of contextual basis to when the United States would decide to set up one of these boarding schools.
And out of curiosity, do we know of any cases where this process was, to use a kind of a grim term, successful? Do we know cases when this resulted in the destruction of a tribe through this process?
Well, it's kind of difficult to say that it resulted in the destruction of a tribe per se, because this is an act of cultural genocide. It did not eliminate the political standing of the tribe itself. So even if the children were taken away, they were re-educated, and then they were sent back, they were still legally and politically American Indians. And even though these boarding schools resulted in the death of children, not everybody who attended these schools died. So you wouldn't necessarily see a death of the tribe in that political sense, their standing as a people, which is why the United States opted other methods of assimilation as well, such as the institution of the blood quantum theory.
The blood
quantum? Blood quantum. So, very controversial subject, especially in Indian country. But a lot of tribes, how they operate their membership is based on this idea of blood quantum. It was instituted by the United States. A lot of tribes have been forced to adopt it, such as by the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, how it's structured. But essentially, the idea of blood quantum is as a full bred, or a full breed, someone who's pure Indian blood, you marry someone who's not an Indian, the idea is your child is half. So genetics, based off an idea of genetics. However, legally speaking, they define Indian blood. So if a person marries out of their tribe and they marry other Indians, that's a reduction of Indian blood. And eventually, you can breed out, in theory, the idea of Indian blood, and the person is no longer legally an Indian. So if you're no longer legally an Indian, then that means your tribe loses population. And if your tribes lose population, then that means they can die out. And if they die out, then they're terminated and the U.S. gains control over all their assets.
Whoops. Weird how that worked out, huh?
Yeah, right? Weird how that worked out. And so, unfortunately, many tribes today, in a colonized mindset, have adopted the idea of blood quantum for their tribal citizen requirements. You have to be 1/4 this to enroll in the tribe, or half to enroll in the tribe. And it's an idea that is completely against indigenous thought in terms of how people were counted as citizens of their nations. And the U.S. really hardlines against tribes in this regard. For example, if you are not a certain percentage of Indian, then you are not eligible for services that the federal government offers. However, your tribe can still accept you as a citizen, but the U.S. won't recognize you as an Indian. And if that's the case, then it's a termination of the trust responsibility to that individual.
And so basically this encourages a more closed approach to interaction and intermarriage with wider society, and also the adoption of racial thinking, which is, I would imagine, entirely alien to all of indigenous thinking before the 19th century.
Precisely. And if you look at population numbers of tribes, about the turn of the 19th century, from the 19th century to the 20th century, you have a reduction down to approximately 250,000 Native Americans left in the country. Nowadays, you see, the numbers are kind of over the place depending on how you define Native American. It's increased, actually, up to 5.7 million at most. That's because you see tribes adopting different systems of what they would qualify for a person to be enrolled into their tribe. And the ideas that have increased those numbers are not blood quantum. A blood quantum is paper genocide, how I like to call it. And it's something that tribes certainly need to move away from.
And is there any sort of movement to, or attempt to, eliminate that as a standard or a legal mechanism with which to destroy indigenous sovereignty?
In some respects, in our generation, or in our contemporary time, I should say, there is certainly more of a push in order to eliminate blood quantum as the idea, because people are recognizing that it's ultimately a way that tribes will be bred out of existence, so to speak. However, the existing institutions, the tribal governments that are in place, operate on a non-indigenous basis. In other words, the idea of these tribal councils, which is a main type of tribal government form, is not indigenous. It's not traditional. But they operate on that because of such things as the Indian Reorganization Act, which, if they adopted, provided a structure of government for them to use. And tribes, speaking of the governments, specifically tribal governments, have grown accustomed to using these, and they become complacent, and they don't want to move from those. So I don't want to necessarily say there's a movement to reform that, a solid movement, but you are seeing in younger generations more agitation in order to reform that idea.
Interesting. So we've gotten to these boarding schools that are working from, what you said, like about the 1850s, 1840s?
Yeah, from about the 1850s onward.
From about the 1850s to about the 19...
In the United States, in the United States, I believe the last one closed in the 1960s.
In the 1960s.
Yes, I mentioned I know people who've been to boarding schools, and one of the elders I talked with recently, she said it was in the 1960s that she went to a boarding school in Oklahoma, her and her sister.
And do we know how many indigenous children were taken away to these boarding schools?
Yes, I don't have the hard statistic on me right now. I might be able to provide that in the thread later on when this is posted. The margins were from 20 to 35% of all indigenous children. And at this point, there are 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States. So we're talking about overall population numbers. From 20 to 35% were taken.
Right. So, I mean, and since this is happening over such a long period of time, even though for much of that period the population was, you said, about 250,000?
By the turn of the 20th century, it was.
By the turn of the 20th century. But because of how long this was a standing policy, we're probably talking of probably over 1 million people, possibly more.
That would have suffered effects from this. The population dispute of North America is something that's been hotly debated for decades. So it would really depend on what population you started with, and then how it progressively got down to the 250,000 by the 20th century. But the numbers definitely would be excessively high.
And what brought about the close of this policy, of this? Did the policy itself evolve and become a softer version of what it had been, or was it basically the same thing from the 1850s till it closed?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because the idea of assimilation actually sprung out of two main thoughts. The first one was greed, because it ended up resulting in the loss of a lot of lands and assets for Native Americans, but also humanitarianism. A lot of people thought this was for the good of Native Americans. They thought that we see these people are having issues. They made no connection to the problems the government was causing for them somehow, but they saw that these people were having issues and they wanted to help them. So many Americans encouraged the idea of assimilation, but it actually wasn't until roughly 1928 that we really see a big event happen that really changed people's idea about such things as like boarding schools. It was in 1928 that a report was released, the Merriam Report, by the U.S. federal government. And this was an extensive report that detailed the conditions in Indian country, all the way from food management to mental health to the boarding schools. And it identified that there was huge systematic issues with these that were causing the problems for Indian people. This report became very popular, and a lot of public criticism started mounting against the federal government because of how they were treating them. So it was actually Franklin D. Roosevelt's that we see a really big change when it came to Indian affairs, more for the positive. He appointed John Collier as Commissioner of the Indian Affairs, and it was Collier who came up with the Indian Reorganization Act. And despite the faults with that act, It was actually a move to help increase tribal sovereignty and improve the conditions that Native Americans were facing. Part of that act eliminated the General Allotment Act, which was another form of assimilation and cultural genocide, but it also helped to reform how the United States took on education. So while the boarding schools still continued in a detrimental form after 1934, they started seeing at least some improvement.
Interesting. And what brought about the close of this policy in the 1960s?
So it was actually starting with President Lyndon Johnson, where he reaffirmed the rights of Native Americans in 1968. But it was in 1970 when we see that Nixon was president. He actually was a major proponent in the American political sphere for tribal sovereignty. And it's actually from about 1968 to 1970, usually one of those 2 years, that it's termed the self-determination era. So since that point in time, the federal government has been working to help tribes to be able to self-determine their future and to govern themselves and to increase their sovereignty. And along with that, we see the end of the boarding schools, because those were fundamentally not helping. They were a fundamental issue within the system itself.
And out of curiosity, in the context of the 1930s and 1940s, where the United States erected itself together with England and other countries, while still having very racist views on many things, in opposition to attempts to Nazi Germany's attempts to implement its superior German culture and impose it on lesser races and all the rest. Was there ever a sort of consciousness that there is a conscious process of destroying cultures here in the Americas? Or was that connection never really thought about?
The connection, in my opinion, was probably never really thought about until recently. And that's mainly because during those times, the 30s and 40s, the American society still held a lot of those racist views. Much of it was still religious, and Christianity had deep roots with their involvement with Native Americans that portrayed them as pagans, as heathens. It was through Christianity that such things as the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny came to fruition, and people still saw those as being right. But it's funny, because when you look at interactions between tribes in the U.S. in the past down to today, it's almost like a pendulum, where it swings from we like tribes to don't like tribes, to like tribes, don't like tribes, back and forth. And you get these pockets of time where the United States says, okay, we need to do right by these people, yet in just a few short years, they've changed their opinion, both society and the government. And it was truly the case back in the 30s and 40s with Franklin D. Roosevelt that you saw the pendulum swing more in favor for tribes. And yet, right into the 50s and 60s, it was the termination era, where the federal government and American society wanted nothing to do with tribes. They wanted to eliminate them, get rid of their reservations. It's what they tried to do, and that resulted in the deaths of Indians, as described in the last episode. And then you see the swing all the way back, starting with Nixon, to, okay, let's help tribes out. Then you see the swing probably roughly around the 90s, at least with the Supreme Court, start to be a little bit more anti-Indian. And then, not to bring modern politics into it too much, but a lot of tribes today are fearful of the new administration, where the pendulum swings even further towards anti-Indian. So when it comes to, drawing that connection between how Americans have treated tribes and, the connections to other historical events such as Nazi Germany, I think those views are starting to become a little bit more evident, but it all goes back to that, protecting the national honor, and those sentiments that people have, and the fact that they want to deny these events because it paints them in a bad light. And while we're seeing more of that coming to fruition, there are still many fields, even in education, where this history is just not told accurately.
And that actually segues into one of the final points that we were going to talk about today, which is, how is this dealt with on a historiographical level? In other words, how is the history of these events written about by historians? Is it something that is actually is now part of the mainstream? These are in many textbooks, or this is something that is still largely isolated in very specialized texts, or is it very misconstrued, or how do you see this happening on a historiographical level?
I see it, I would say since the 80s. It's been getting better, especially in academia, because you see the introduction of more indigenous people into those fields. Again, like I said prior to this, Vine Deloria being one of the first indigenous scholars to really get out there and speak to the public and to also reach those higher levels of scholarly works. He truly was a starting point, but from him and then from others, you start to see more indigenous people getting involved and to speak their voice. And that's important because it's the indigenous people who need to be able to speak for themselves. There's been too many years of other people speaking for them, and unfortunately the story just not being told accurately. But the unfortunate part is that that's happening in higher levels of academia. We're not really seeing it trickle down to other educational levels, such as high school, middle school, even elementary school, where ideas of Columbus discovering mainland America and being friends with the Indians is still something that many preschoolers themselves are taught, or the idea of Pocahontas, and that's how Indians are supposed to look, all Indians. In line with that, one of my favorite books is a compilation of scholarly works entitled Beyond Germs, Native Depopulation in North America. And it's a compilation of works that really tackle that idea of virgin soil that we spoke about earlier. But one of the authors for it, he brings out that the problem is not confined to the popular literature epitomized by the works of Charles Mann. Instead, the traditional narratives circulate widely in academic writing, sometimes even in the writing of those who explicitly critique it. And he goes on to list modern examples from 2003, 2010, 2008, 2012, just going down this page right here, of scholars who have in their works supported ideas such as virgin soil. And that in itself contributes to the cultural genocide as well, because that's the scapegoat reason people use to avoid the responsibility of the death of people and of their culture. And they point to those reasons and say, well, it was organic that the tribes died out. So there's no investment in their culture because that's just how nature goes. And that's the argument that you often hear. So while it is good that indigenous people are getting more involved in being able to give their narrative of the story, there's still much opposition against their ways and against their side of things.
Interesting. That actually reminds me. The name escapes me. I think there's a play. I think it's a Spanish play from the from the 17th century, if I'm not mistaken, where a Spanish official is sent to this small town, and he is violently murdered, and no one in the town takes responsibility, and so it's decided that the town itself murdered him, but that also leaves that no one individually murdered the official. So it seems like by attributing it to disease or an act of God or something like that, it's just it makes sure that everyone has their hands relatively clean.
Exactly. It gives rise to even other further myths and ideas. Anthropology Nerd, she talks a lot about these ideas too, and she did that series on the subreddit for Bad History about the 7 myths of conquest, 7 or 9, but where she talks about the idea of bloodless conquest. If people believe the idea that disease is what was primarily responsible for the death of the natives, then why blame the Europeans who simply strolled in and then just said, okay, well, we'll take the land since no one's here? That truly is something that people still believe. And it's detrimental because it hurts the discourse that can occur, but it causes that disconnect between the problems that indigenous communities are facing today and the direct correlation that they have to those incidents back then, where the reality is the Europeans didn't stroll in there after disease happened. They strolled in there after disease happened, killed the remaining ones, and then disease continued to happen.
Right. It's just it's a pretty dark panorama. But in terms of the historiography on this, as someone who specializes in this, where would you like to see your field go on an academic level and popular understanding of this issue go on a more general level?
Well, academically, I would like to see an increase of indigenous scholars participating in this field. But I would also like to see more acceptance of indigenous methodologies in terms of doing research and how it's presented. Because in our world, it's largely dominated by the Western thought of things, Western arguments, Western paradigms of how to conduct these research. And while they have their uses and they definitely are beneficial, a lot of people are finding that they fall short in certain areas. And that includes with regards to indigenous communities. I believe we would have a more holistic view of things if we were to include how those indigenous communities themselves would conduct research.
Could you clarify that a bit more? Like, what aspect of for example, what would an indigenous methodology be that would not necessarily be accepted by most of the traditional norms in academia?
All right, so for example, in the Western style of conducting research, typically it is the norm for the researcher to not be personally invested in the research that they're doing. They strictly observe things from afar, or if they do get involved, it's a limited contact. They don't form a real personal relationship with their research subject or the research itself to a degree. Whereas in an indigenous methodology, the idea is that you want to have that relationship. You want to spend time with that person to really get to know who they are, because by having that relationship, you yourself will be more accountable to them. So it's a much more participatory kind of action rather than just a strict observation, where it involves befriending who you're talking to, getting to know who they are, spending an extensive amount of time with them. And the argument against that is that it forms a bias. But in an indigenous research paradigm, a bias is not necessarily a bad thing, because you can understand that person now. You can relate to them on a more personal level. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily a method that's widely accepted in all fields of academia.
Right. I mean, and honestly, it makes sense even within Western the traditional canons, because I remember reading article by British Marxist historian Perry Anderson on the Asiatic mode of production, which I'm sure you're unfortunately familiar with, which is Marx's way to basically explain all civilizations which weren't European. And yeah, so in his article, this is to speak to your point, one of the things he cites is John Mills, father of John Stuart Mills, the famous economist. And John Mills wrote a series of books on India, British India, and its history and culture, and he never visited India. And his books were deeply flawed, and Marx, who also had never visited India, but wrote about India, based his reports on John Mills, who also never went to India. And so part of Perry Anderson, in speaking about why Marx's views were so erroneous, says, well, neither of them really were connected to this place. Neither of them ever went there, studied the culture personally. They did not really understand the culture. Therefore, it's obvious that they came up with conclusions that were very erroneous. So, I mean, it makes sense to me, even within these canons of traditional canons, to say it's good to go to the place, to live there, to have insights, personal insights into a given situation. So that seems to be a very valid position to me personally. So I agree there. And in terms of historiography, for like how it's presented to more popular audiences, what would you like to see?
I would definitely like to see a more in-depth analytical view when it comes to certain works that have become popularized, because even today, on the subreddit, you get people who reference all the time Charles Mann, Dobbins, Crosby, Diamond still. And these works have become so popularized that they think those are the standard when it comes to whatever the subject is that they're speaking on. And while they definitely provide an avenue, if these authors themselves who end up having these popular works could take a critical analysis of their own work as well, I think that might help the wider audience to appreciate the fact that their work is not the end-all be-all when it comes to those subjects. But it's more than just those authors. It really depends on the communities that are in charge of these things, really working more to spread out works that are not necessarily well known that could help clarify these things. I mean, I guess what I'm essentially saying is just a shift in societal conduct, which unfortunately probably doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with the little things, being able to get out there to do these things like these podcasts where people listen, to be able to talk about the things that have been oppressed, that have been pushed out of the way because they're considered inferior, and to really bring them to the forefront of things. So ultimately, what I would like to see is just essentially a broader version of what I would like to see in academia. More indigenous scholars getting out there and people recognizing the importance of their work and then purporting that themselves. So that way you have more diversity out there in the fields of academia rather than just one solid end-all be-all answer. Not just academia, but also popular history and society as well.
Perfect. And where would, if someone is interested in learning more about these subjects, any specific author or any specific collections or organizations that they can go to find out more?
In terms of literature, it's kind of all over the place in the sense because the field here is very complex. I mean, it kind of depends on what you want to go for. If you want to consider things legalistically and politically, there's going to be its own section for that, as opposed to if you want to think about things, in theory and methods. It's funny because one of the big confusions that a lot of non-indigenous people have in America when it comes to Indian tribes is that they think there's one person you could go to talk to all tribes.
Yeah.
It reminds me of just a short story that's related to this. One of my instructors actually went to my state's legislator a couple months ago to talk to them about tribes. And these are the people who make laws for this state, and a lot of them deal with tribes. And a person stands up and asks, so how many tribes are there? Says there's 29 federally recognized tribes in the state of Washington. So do we go to you, or who do we go to talk to all tribes? And he looks at her and doesn't answer. And it's funny because that is essentially the view that many Americans have, where it's not all consolidated. There's much diversity that exists out there. So I would say, when it comes to resources, do some research on the person who's being looked at and see where they're coming from. Are they an indigenous scholar themselves? Have they actually, spent time in the area that they're researching, as per the earlier example? But are they consulted with by tribes, for example? So some names that I'd like to put out there: Stephen L. Pavar. He's an author of the Rights of Indians and Tribes book. It's a very comprehensive book dealing with legal matters, respecting the rights of tribes and individual Indians. And then I would also like to say Begeli Chalissa. She's an author on indigenous research methodologies, and also Stephen Wilson. He himself also another author for indigenous research methodologies. And then, of course, Vine Deloria Jr. He's written a whole host of books regarding spirituality, culture, political and legal context. Those are some names that are very prominent in Indian country and that provide a very good context for the framework that we've been speaking about here.
Perfect. So our listeners now have, I think, both more knowledge about the issue of cultural genocide in general. They have a lot of, I think, very important insights in how they should approach this topic, not just the study of the content, but how they should, on a theoretical level, approach this subject and try to delineate different voices, different points of view, and have a pretty good starting point to understand this phenomenon better. So, Kyle, thank you very much for coming on and talking with us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you, and a big thanks for all of you listening and to all of our supporters on Patreon.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.